This is the first video for weeks 3 to 4 in contracts. It's going to track the two videos. I'm going to put up two videos that will track the postings or the notes that I've put up for these 2 weeks. Sorry, I just was interrupted with a phone call. One of the car warranty phone calls. You can't block them. In any event, our first posting that we're going to go through is Chapter 2, Agreement Part 2, and we're focusing on acceptance. We already have identified the elements of a valid offer, how an offer can become irrevocable, and how an offer can terminate. It may well be that we have a valid offer, and whether it's irrevocable or not, it hasn't been terminated, and therefore the offeree may wish to accept it. So we're looking at valid acceptance. Valid acceptance we can think of as really two parts. Number one, what is a valid acceptance? Two, when is it effective? Number one, again, what is a valid acceptance? And two, when is it effective? We'll then look at effective times of revocation and rejections as we get to the latter part of the posting. But let's start with what is a valid acceptance. In effect, it's a question of fact that has to be answered, and the question would be, has there been a communication from the offeree that reveals or shows that the offeree has unequivocally, I think could be understood as leaving no doubt, accepted the offer. And perhaps the image suggested by the authors or the mirror image rule helps, meaning that the acceptance has to, in one sense or another, mirror the offer. That doesn't mean that the acceptance has to be word for word matching the offer, but what it does mean is that when we look at the communication that purports to be the acceptance, it's very clear, it's unequivocal, there's no doubt that the offeree has accepted the offer. Silence, as the authors note, typically cannot be considered an acceptance, and there could be a few exceptions to that, but we're not going to, right now at least, be concerned about it. So now we're getting to the second part of our inquiry. We know what is a valid acceptance, but we're now getting to the question, when is a valid acceptance effective? When does it become effective? And at this point, there's a topic in Chapter 1, or the first posting, that I really didn't address. It's there, but I just didn't address it in a screenshot video. And that is the difference between a unilateral contract and a bilateral contract. So first, let's just understand what those two types of contracts are. And once we get that understanding in place, we'll be able to move in the question of when is acceptance effective. So a unilateral contract is a promise that contains an offer that can only be accepted by an act. A promise that contains an offer that can only be accepted by an act. Rewards are often thought of as a unilateral contract type of situation. In other words, what happens is the person has lost jewelry, a lost pet, whatever, and makes an offer perhaps to the general public that I will pay X number of dollars if my missing jewelry is returned or if my pet is returned. someone returns the missing jewelry or returns the missing pet, we now have the formation of a unilateral contract. A bilateral contract, on the other hand, is where parties exchange promises. So in this bilateral contract, the contract is formed by an exchange of promises. A typical example of a bilateral contract would be a contract for the sale of real estate. And let's assume that you're looking to buy a house. And you find it, the seller and you agree on a price, etc., etc. You're going to end up with a written contract, by the way, that you both will sign. That contract has to be in writing and signed because of the statute of limitations, but also there's other reasons why we really need to have that in writing. But if we look at the contract, the real estate contract, it is one where the parties exchange promises. The seller is basically promising to the buyer that I will provide you evidence that I have good title to this property, and I will transfer to you the title to the property in the form of a deed. And the buyer is promising that if the title is good, that the buyer can obtain financing for the transaction, that the buyer will show up at a certain time, typically known as the closing, and hand over the money. But what we're going to see and receive the deed, what we're going to see then, let's just assume, was today is February 4th, the parties enter into a contract for the sale of real estate on February 4th, and that's going to be an exchange of promises, and the actual transfer of the deed and the money and the exchange of title probably won't occur until sometime in April. So we've got our unilateral contract and we've got our bilateral contract, and with those thoughts in mind, let's go back up. How is an offer to enter into a unilateral contract effectively accepted? It's accepted by performance of the act called for in the offer, the return of the missing jewelry, by way of example. If we go down to bilateral contract, and now it's a little bit more of a, I wouldn't want to use the word complicated, but a little bit more to consider. So I'm just going to track what I have. The acceptance becomes effective when it is made, and I like to use the word transmitted, in accordance with the terms of the offer. Let's just stop at that point. So the offeror, the person making the offer, can specify in the offer how it is to be accepted. And then acceptance will be effective when the offeree transmits the acceptance consistent with what's been required in the terms of the offer for acceptance. Oftentimes, however, the offer doesn't specify how it is to be accepted, in which case acceptance becomes effective at the time it is communicated or transmitted, provided that the medium, or if you will, the way or manner of acceptance is reasonable under the circumstances. So an old-fashioned illustration of the rule, I remember when this wasn't an old-fashioned illustration, but an old-fashioned illustration of the rule is sometimes referred to as the mailbox rule. It provides that if the offer was mailed to the offeree, and the offer doesn't otherwise state how it is to be accepted, then acceptance is going to be effective at the point in time the offeree mails, or deposits in the mail, if you will, a valid acceptance. If in this latter case the offeree does not use a reasonable method of acceptance, or uses a method or medium not called for in the offer, the acceptance will nevertheless become effective when it's received by the offeree. And I always use this ridiculous example, on purpose ridiculous, where the offeror does not mail it back or call or otherwise communicate except by having hiring a plane and having the plane drag a banner over the football stadium saying to the offeror, I accept your offer, with enough of a description to identify it, and the offeror happens to be in attendance at the football game and sober enough to look up and see the banner, in which case at that point acceptance would be effective. That's what we mean by that last sentence. So at this point we've now identified a valid offer. We've identified how it can be terminated. It may, however, not be terminated, and the offeree then accepts it. So we're through the basics of offer and acceptance, except to look at one last question. And the way we can set this question up is this. We have an offer that's pending, a valid offer that's pending, and we have an offeree who has decided to accept the offer. If we could get a little bubble over that person's head in the picture, it would be, you know what, I'm going to accept the offer. At that same time, however, the offeror has changed their mind, and the offeror now wants to revoke the offer, terminate the offer by revocation. So we could put a little bubble over the offeror's head in this picture I'm thinking about, and at that same time, the offeree has decided to accept, the offeror has decided to revoke the offer. Maybe you've come along and said to the offeror, you know what, I'll pay more money for whatever we are trying to sell if it's a sale situation. Now the plot thickens, because what we have is a situation where the offeror is taking steps to revoke the offer, and the offeree is taking steps to accept the offer. We've already identified when acceptance is effective, but what we need to also understand, if we're going to figure this problem out, is when is revocation effective. And revocation of an offer is effective when the offeree learns of the revocation. Now we're going to have an interesting situation, and we can look at this in a little problem in the back of chapter 2 in the book. It's problem 11.4 on page 33. And what we see is Dennis mails a valid offer to sell his car to Tonya. He mails it to her office on a Thursday, and she must have received it by Friday. In any event, on Saturday, Dennis changes his mind, and he transmits a fax transmission to Tanya's office to revoke the offer. Now let's just freeze frame this. When Tonya learns of the revocation, in this case then, learns of the fax transmission, the offer will be terminated. However, Tonya is not in the office over the weekend. She's a young lawyer who doesn't like to work on the weekends, I suspect. And so what happens is she never sees the fax transmission, and on her way to work Monday, she drops a letter of acceptance into the mailbox. And when she drops that letter of acceptance into the mailbox, the offer has been effective, and that's how that case has worked out. If you're still a little puzzled by this, after you think it through, just send me